Chapter 16. Ricardo's Theory of Profit. Section 1. Individual instances in which Ricardo distinguishes between surplus value and profit. It has already been shown in some detail that the laws of surplus value, or rather of the rate of surplus value, assuming the working day is given, do not so directly and simply coincide with, nor are they applicable to, the laws of profit, as Ricardo supposes. It has been shown that he wrongly identifies surplus value with profit, and that these are only identical insofar as the total capital consists of variable capital, or is laid out directly in wages, and that therefore what Ricardo deals with under the name of profit is in fact surplus value. Only in this case can the total product simply be resolved into wages and surplus value. Ricardo evidently shares Smith's view that the total value of the annual product resolves itself into revenues, hence also his confusion of value with cost price. It is not necessary to repeat here that the rate of profit is not directly governed by the same laws as the rate of surplus value. Firstly, we have seen that the rate of profit can rise or fall as a result of a fall or rise in rent, independently of any change in the value of labor. Secondly, the amount of profit is equal to the absolute amount of surplus value. The latter, however, is determined not only by the rate of surplus value, but just as much by the number of workers employed. The same amount of profit is therefore possible with a falling rate of surplus value and a rising number of workers, and vice versa. Thirdly, with a given rate of surplus value, the rate of profit depends on the organic composition of capital. Fourthly, with a given surplus value, the organic composition is also assumed to be given, the rate of profit depends on the relative value of the different parts of the capital, which may be differently affected, partly by economy of power, etc., in the use of the means of production, partly by variations in value, which may affect one part of capital while they leave the rest untouched. Finally, one has to take into account the differences in the composition of capital arising from the process of circulation. Some of the observations that occur in Ricardo's writing should have led him to the distinction between surplus value and profit. Because he fails to make this distinction, he appears in some passages to descend to the vulgar view, as has already been indicated in the analysis of Chapter 1 on value, the view that profit is a mere addition over and above the value of the commodity. For instance, when he speaks of the determination of profit on capital, in which the fixed capital predominates, etc. This was the source of much nonsense among his successors. This vulgar view is bound to arise if the proposition, which in practice is correct, that on the average, capitals of equal size yield equal profits, or that profit depends on the size of the capital employed, is not connected by a series of intermediary links with the general laws of value. In short, if profit and surplus value are treated as identical, which is only correct for the aggregate capital. Accordingly, Ricardo has no means for determining a general rate of profit. Ricardo realizes that the rate of profit is not modified by those variations of the value of commodities which affect all parts of capital equally, as for example variations in the value of money. He should therefore have concluded that it is affected by such variations in the value of commodities which do not affect all parts of capital equally, that therefore variations in the rate of profit may occur while the value of labor remains unchanged, and that even the rate of profit may move in the opposite direction to variations in the value of labor. Above all, however, he should have kept in mind that here the surplus product, or what is for him the same thing, surplus value, or again the same thing, surplus labor, when he is considering it as a subspecie profit, is not calculated in proportion to the variable capital alone, but in proportion to the total capital advanced. With reference to a change in the value of money, he says, "The variation in the value of money, however great, makes no difference in the rate of profits. For suppose the goods of the manufacturer to rise from £1,000 to 2,000, or 100%. If his capital, on which the variations of money have as much effect as on the value of produce, if his machinery, buildings, and stock in trade also rise 100%, his rate of profits will be the same. If with a capital of a given value, he can, by economy in labor, double the quantity of produce, and it fall to half its former price, it will bear the same proportion to the capital that produced it, which it did before, and consequently, profits will still be at the same rate. If at the same time that he doubles the quantity of produce by the employment of the same capital, the value of money is by any accident lowered 1/2, the produce will sell for twice the money value that it did before, but the capital employed to produce it will also be of twice its former money value, and therefore in this case too, the value of the produce will bear the same proportion to the value of the capital as it did before. If Ricardo means surplus produce when he writes produce in the last passage, then this is correct. For the rate of profit is equal to the surplus produce, that is value, divided by the capital employed. Thus, if the surplus produce is 10 and capital is 100, the rate of profit is 10 over 100, or 10%. If, however, he means the total product, then the way he puts it is not accurate. In that case, by proportion of the value of the produce to the value of capital, he evidently means nothing but the excess of the value of the commodity over the value of the capital advanced. In any case, it is obvious that here he does not identify profit with surplus value, or the rate of profit with the rate of surplus value. The latter is equal to the surplus value divided by the value of labor, or the variable capital. Ricardo says in chapter 32, "The raw produce of which commodities are made is supposed to have fallen in price, and therefore commodities will fall on that account. True, they will fall, but their fall will not be attended with any diminution in the money income of the producer. If he sells his commodity for less money, it is only because one of the materials from which it is made has fallen in value. If the clothier will sell his cloth for 900 pounds instead of 1,000, his income will not be less if the wool from which it is made has declined 100 pounds in value." The particular point with which Ricardo is actually dealing, the effect in a practical case, does not concern us here. But a sudden fall in the value of wool would of course affect adversely the money income of those clothiers who had on their hands a large stock of finished cloth, manufactured at a time when wool was dearer, and which has to be sold after the price of wool has dropped. If, as Ricardo assumes here, the clothiers set in motion the same amount of labor as before, it is clear that their money income, taken in absolute terms, will not be less, but their rate of profit will be greater than previously. For, say it was 10%, i.e. 100 pounds, the same amount as before would now have to be reckoned on 900 instead of 1,000. In the first case, the rate of profit was 10%. In the second, it is 1 over 9, or 11 1/9%. Since Ricardo, moreover, presupposes that the raw produce of which commodities are made has fallen generally, the general rate of profit would rise, and not only the rate of profit in one branch of production. It is all the more strange that Ricardo does not realize this, because he understands it when the opposite takes place. For in chapter 6, on profits, Ricardo deals with the case where, as a result of an increase in the price of necessaries, owing to the cultivation of worse land and the consequent rise in differential rent, firstly, wages rise, and secondly, all raw produce from the surface of the earth. This assumption is by no means necessary. Cotton may very well fall in price, so can silk and even wool and linen, although the price of corn may be rising. In the first place, he says that the surplus value, he calls it profit, of the farmer will fall because the value of the product of the 10 men whom he employs continues to be 720 pounds, and from this fund of 720 he has to hand over more in wages. And he continues, "But the rate of profits will fall still more, because the capital of the farmer consists in a great measure of raw produce, such as his corn, his unthreshed wheat and barley, his horses and cows, which would all rise in price in consequence of the rise of produce. His absolute profits would fall from 480 pounds to 445 pounds and 15 shillings. But if from the cause which I have just stated, his capital should rise from 3,000 to 3,200, the rate of his profits would, when corn was at 5 pounds and 2 shillings 10 pence, be under 14%. If a manufacturer had also employed 3,000 pounds in his business, he would be obliged, in consequence of the rise of wages, to increase his capital in order to be enabled to carry on the same business. If his commodities sold before for 720 pounds, they would continue to sell at the same price, but the wages of labor, which were before 240 pounds, would rise to 274 pounds and 5 shillings. In the first case, he would have a balance of 480 pounds as profit on 3,000. In the second, he would have a profit of only 445 and 15 shillings on an increased capital, and therefore his profits would conform to the altered rate of those of the farmer. In this passage, therefore, Ricardo distinguishes between absolute profit, that is equal to the surplus value, and rate of profit, and also shows that the rate of profit falls more as a result of the change in the value of the capital advanced than the absolute profit falls as a result of the rise in the value of labor. The rate of profit would have also fallen if the value of labor had remained the same, because the same absolute profit would have to be calculated on a greater capital. The reverse result, i.e. a rise in the rate of profit, as distinct from a rise in surplus value or absolute profit, would take place in the first instance cited from him, where the value of the raw produce falls. It is evident, therefore, that rises and falls in the rate of profit may also be brought about by circumstances other than the rise and fall in the absolute profit, or the rise and fall in the rate of surplus value. In connection with the last quoted passage, Ricardo writes, "Articles of jewelry, of iron, of plate, and of copper would not rise, because none of the raw produce from the surface of the earth enters into their composition. The prices of these commodities would not rise, but the rate of profit in these branches of production would rise above that in the others. For in the latter, a smaller surplus value, because of the rise in wages, would correspond to a capital outlay that had grown in value for two reasons. Firstly, because the outlay in wages had increased. Secondly, because the outlay in raw materials had increased. In the second case, i.e. jewelry, etc., there is a smaller surplus value on a capital outlay in which only the variable part is grown because of the rise in wages." In these passages, Ricardo himself throws overboard his whole theory of profit, which is based on the false identification of the rate of surplus value with the rate of profit. In every case, agricultural as well as manufacturing profits are lowered by a rise in the price of raw produce if it be accompanied by a rise of wages. It follows from what Ricardo himself has said that even if the rise in the price of raw produce is not accompanied by a rise of wages, the rate of profit would be lowered by an increase of that part of the advanced capital which consists of raw produce. Suppose the price of silks, velvets, furniture, and any other commodities not required by the laborer to rise in consequence of more labor being expended on them. Would not that affect profits? Certainly not, for nothing can affect profits but a rise in wages. Silks and velvets are not consumed by the laborer, and therefore cannot raise wages. The rate of profit in these particular spheres of production would certainly fall, although the value of labor, wages, remain the same. The raw material used by the silk manufacturers, piano manufacturers, furniture manufacturers, etc. would have become dearer, and therefore the proportion borne by the same surplus value to the capital laid out would have fallen, and hence the rate of profit. And the general rate of profit consists of the average of the particular rates of profit in all branches of business. Or, in order to make the same average profit as before, these manufacturers would raise the price of their commodities. Such a nominal rise in prices does not directly affect the rate of profit, but the distribution of profit. Ricardo returns once more to the case considered above, where the surplus value, that is absolute profit, falls, because the price of the necessaries, and along with these also rent, rises. I must again observe that the rate of profits would fall much more rapidly than I have estimated in my calculation, for the value of the produce being what I have stated it, under the circumstances supposed, the value of the farmer's stock would be greatly increased, from its necessarily consisting of many of the commodities which had risen in value. Before corn could rise from 4 pounds to 12, his capital would probably be doubled in exchangeable value, and be worth 6,000 pounds instead of 3,000. If then his profit were 180 pounds, or 6% on his original capital, profits would not at that time be really at a higher rate than 3%, for 6,000 at 3% gives 180, and on those terms, only could a new farmer with 6,000 pounds money in his pocket enter into the farming business. Many trades would derive some advantage, more or less from the same source. The brewer, the distiller, the clothier, or the linen manufacturer would be partly compensated for the diminution of their profits by the rise in the value of their stock of raw and finished materials. But a manufacturer of hardware, of jewelry, of many other commodities, as well as those whose capitals uniformly consisted of money, would be subject to the whole fall in the rate of profits, without any compensation whatever. What is important here is only something of which Ricardo is not aware. Namely, that he throws overboard his identification of profit with surplus value, and admits that the rate of profit can be affected by a variation in the value of the constant capital independently of the value of labor. Moreover, his illustration is only partially correct. The advantage which the farmer, clothier, etc. would derive from the rise in price of the stock of commodities they have on hand and on the market would of course cease as soon as they had sold these commodities. The increased value of their capital would similarly no longer represent a gain for them when this capital was used up and had to be replaced. They would then all find themselves in the position of the new farmer, cited by Ricardo himself, who would have to advance a capital of 6,000 in order to make a profit of 3%. On the other hand, the jeweler, manufacturer of hardware, money dealer, etc., although at first they would not receive any compensation for their losses, would realize a rate of profit of more than 3%, for only the capital laid out in wages would have risen in value, whereas their constant capital remained unchanged. One further point of importance, in connection with this compensation of the falling profit by the rise in the value of the capital, mentioned by Ricardo, is that for the capitalist, and generally as far as the division of product of annual labor is concerned, it is a question not only of the distribution of the product among the various shareholders in the revenue, but also of the division of this product into capital and revenue. Section 2. Formation of the general rate of profit, average profit, or usual profit. Subsection A. The starting point of the Ricardian theory of profit is the antecedent, predetermined average rate of profit. Ricardo is by no means theoretically clear here. I have already remarked that the market price of a commodity may exceed its natural or necessary price, as it may be produced in less abundance than the new demand for it requires. This, however, is but a temporary effect. The high profits on capital employed in producing that commodity will naturally attract capital to that trade, and as soon as the requisite funds are supplied and the quantity of the commodity is duly increased, its price will fall, and the profits of the trade will conform to the general level. A fall in the general rate of profits is by no means incompatible with a partial rise of profits in particular employments. It is through the inequality of profits that capital is moved from one employment to another. Whilst then general profits are falling and gradually settling at a lower level in consequence of the rise of wages and the increasing difficulty of supplying the increased population with necessaries, the profits of the farmer may, for an interval of some little duration, be above the former level. An extraordinary stimulus may be also given for a certain time to a particular branch of foreign and colonial trade. It should be recollected that the prices always vary in the market, and in the first instance, through the comparative state of demand and supply. Although cloth could be furnished at 40 shillings per yard and give the usual profits of stock, it may rise to 60 or 80 shillings from a general change of fashion. The makers of cloth will for a time have unusual profits, but capital will naturally flow to that manufacture until the supply and demand are again at their fair level, when the price of cloth will again sink to 40 shillings, its natural or necessary price. In the same manner, with every increased demand for corn, it may rise so high as to afford more than the general profits to the farmer. If there be plenty of fertile land, the price of corn will again fall to its former standard, after the requisite quantity of capital has been employed in producing it, and profits will be as before. But if there be not plenty of fertile land, if to produce this additional quantity, more than the usual quantity of capital and labor be required, corn will not fall to its former level. Its natural price will be raised, and the farmer, instead of obtaining permanently larger profits, will find himself obliged to be satisfied with the diminished rate which is the inevitable consequence of the rise of wages, produced by the rise of necessaries. If the working day is given, or if only such differences occur in the working day in different trades as are compensated by the particular characteristics of the different kinds of labor, then the general rate of surplus value, i.e. of surplus labor, is given, since wages are on the average the same. Ricardo is preoccupied with this idea, and he confuses the general rate of surplus value with the general rate of profit. I have shown that with the same general rate of surplus value, the rates of profit in different branches of production must be very different, if the commodities are to be sold at their respective values. The general rate of profit is formed through the total surplus value produced being calculated on the total capital of society, of the class of capitalists. Each capital, therefore, in each particular branch, represents a portion of a total capital of the same organic composition, both as regards constant and variable capital and circulating and fixed capital. As such a portion, it draws its dividends from the surplus value created by the aggregate capital in accordance with its size. The surplus value thus distributed, the amount of surplus value which falls to the share of a block of capital of given size, for example 100 pounds, during a given period of time, for example 1 year, constitutes the average profit, or the general rate of profit, and as such it enters into the costs of production of every sphere of production. If this share per 100 is 15, then the usual profit equals 15%, and the cost price is 115 pounds. It can be less if, for instance, only a part of the capital advanced enters as wear and tear into the process of the creation of value. but it is always equal to the capital consumed plus 15%, the average profit on the capital advanced. If in one case, £100 entered into the product, and in another only 50, then in the first case, the cost price would be 115, and in the second case, it would be 65. Thus, both capitals would have sold their commodities at the same cost price, i.e. at a price which yielded the same rate of profit to both. It is evident that the emergence, realization, creation of the general rate of profit necessitates the transformation of values into cost prices that are different from these values. Ricardo, on the contrary, assumes the identity of values and cost prices because he confuses the rate of profit with the rate of surplus value. Hence, he has not the faintest notion of the general change which takes place in the prices of commodities in the course of the establishment of a general rate of profit, before there can be any talk of a general rate of profit. He accepts this rate of profit as something pre-existent, which therefore even plays a part in his determination of value. See Chapter 1 on value. Having postulated the general rate of profit, he only concerns himself with the exceptional modifications in prices which are necessary for the maintenance, for the continued existence of this general rate of profit. He does not realize at all that in order to create the general rate of profit, values must first be transformed into cost prices, and that therefore, when he presupposes a general rate of profit, he is no longer dealing directly with the values of commodities. Moreover, the passage under consideration only expresses the Smithian concept, and even this in a one-sided way, because Ricardo is preoccupied with his notion of the general rate of surplus value. According to him, the rate of profit rises above the average level only in particular branches of production, because there, the market price rises above the natural price owing to the relation between supply and demand, underproduction and overproduction. Competition, influx of new capital into one branch of production, or withdrawal of old capital from another will then equalize market price and natural price, and reduce the profit of the particular branch to the general level. Here, the real level of profit is assumed as constant and predetermined, and it is only a question of reducing the profit to this level in particular spheres of production in which it has risen above or fallen below it, as a result of the action of supply and demand. Ricardo, moreover, always assumes that the commodities whose prices yield more than the average profit stand above their value, and that those which yield less than the average profit stand below their value. If competition makes their market value conform to their value, then the level is established. According to Ricardo, the level itself can only rise or fall if wages fall or rise for a relatively long period. That is to say, if the rate of relative surplus value falls or rises, and this occurs without any change in prices. Yet Ricardo himself admits here that there can be very significant variations in prices in different spheres of production, according to the ratio of circulating and fixed capital. But even when a general rate of profit is established, and therefore cost prices, the rate of profit in particular branches may rise because the hours of work in them are longer, and consequently the rate of absolute surplus value rises. That competition between the workers cannot level this out is proved by the intervention of the state. The rate of profit will rise in these particular spheres without the market price rising above the natural price. Competition between capitals, however, can, and in the long run will, prevent that this excess profit accrues entirely to the capitalists in these particular fields. They will have to reduce the prices of their commodities below their natural prices, or the other spheres will raise their prices a little, or if they do not actually raise them, because a fall in value of these commodities may supervene. Then at any rate, they will not lower them as much as the development of the productive power of labor in their own branches of production required. The general level will rise and the cost prices will change. Furthermore, if a new branch of production comes into being in which a disproportionate amount of living labor is employed in relation to accumulated labor, in which therefore the composition of capital is far below the average composition, which determines the average profit, the relations of supply and demand in this new trade may make it possible to sell its output above its cost price, at a price approximating more closely to its actual value. Competition can level this out only through the raising of the general level of profit, because capital on the whole realizes, sets in motion a greater quantity of unpaid surplus labor. The relations of supply and demand do not, in the first instance, as Ricardo maintains, cause the commodity to be sold above its value, but merely cause it to be sold above its cost price, at a price approximating to its value. The equalization can therefore bring about not its reduction to the old level, but the establishment of a new level. Subsection B. Ricardo's mistakes regarding the influence of colonial trade and foreign trade in general on the rate of profit. The same applies, for example, to colonial trade, where as a result of slavery and the bounty of nature, the value of labor is lower than in the old country, or perhaps because, in fact or in law, landed property has not developed there. If capitals from the mother country can be freely transferred to this new trade, then they will reduce the specific excess profit in this trade, but will raise the general level of profit, as Adam Smith observes quite correctly. On this point, Ricardo always helps himself out with the phrase, "But in the old trades, the quantity of labor employed has nevertheless remained the same, and so have wages. The general rate of profit is, however, determined by the ratio of unpaid labor to paid labor, and to the capital advance not in this or that sphere of the economy, but in all spheres to which the capital may be freely transferred. The ratio may stay the same in 9/10, but if it alters in 1/10, then the general rate of profit in all 10 must change. Whenever there is an increase in the quantity of unpaid labor set in motion by a capital of a given size, the effect of competition can only be that capitals of equal size draw equal dividends, equal shares in this increased surplus labor, but not that the dividend of each individual capital remains the same or is reduced to its former share in surplus labor, despite the increase of surplus labor in proportion to the total capital advanced. If Ricardo makes this assumption, he has no grounds whatsoever for contesting Adam Smith's view that the rate of profit is reduced merely by the growing competition between capitals due to their accumulation. For he himself assumes here that the rate of profit is reduced simply by competition, although the rate of surplus value is increasing. This is indeed connected with his second false assumption, that leaving out of account the lowering or raising of wages, the rate of profit can never rise or fall except as a result of temporary deviations of the market price from the natural price. And what is natural price? That price which is equal to the capital outlay plus the average profit. Thus one arrives again at the assumption that average profit can only fall or rise in the same way as the relative surplus value. Ricardo is therefore wrong when, contradicting Adam Smith, he says, quote, "Any change from one foreign trade to another, or from home to foreign trade, cannot, in my opinion, affect the rate of profits." He is equally wrong in supposing that the rate of profit does not affect cost prices because it does not affect values. Ricardo is wrong in thinking that if, in consequence of particularly favorable circumstances, profits in a branch of foreign trade rise above the general level of profits must always be re-established by reducing these profits to the former level, and not by raising the general level of profits. They contend that the equality of profits will be brought about by the general rise of profits, and I am of opinion that the profits of the favored trade will speedily subside to the general level. Because of his completely wrong conception of the rate of profit, Ricardo misunderstands entirely the influence of foreign trade when it does not directly lower the price of the laborer's food. He does not see how enormously important it is for England, for example, to secure cheaper raw materials for industry, and that in this case, as I have shown previously, the rate of profit rises although prices fall, whereas in the reverse case, with rising prices, the rate of profit can fall, even if wages remain the same in both cases. It is not, therefore, in consequence of the extension of the market that the rate of profit is raised. The rate of profit does not depend on the price of the individual commodity, but on the amount of surplus labor which can be realized with a given capital. Elsewhere, Ricardo also fails to recognize the importance of the market because he does not understand the nature of money. In connection with the above, it must be noted that Ricardo commits all these blunders because he attempts to carry through his identification of the rate of surplus value with the rate of profit by means of forced abstractions. The vulgar mob has therefore concluded that theoretical truths are abstractions which are at variance with reality, instead of seeing on the contrary that Ricardo does not carry true abstract thinking far enough, and is therefore driven into false abstraction. Section 3. Law of the diminishing rate of profit. Subsection A. Wrong presuppositions in the Ricardian conception of the diminishing rate of profit. This is one of the most important points in the Ricardian system. the rate of profit has a tendency to fall. Why? Adam Smith says, as a result of the growing accumulation and the growing competition between capitals which accompanies it. Ricardo retorts, competition can level out profits in the different spheres of production. We have seen above that he is not consistent in this, but it cannot lower the general rate of profit. This would only be possible if, as a result of the accumulation of capital, the capital grew so much more rapidly than the population, that the demand for labor was constantly greater than its supply, and therefore wages, both nominal and real wages in terms of use value, were constantly rising in value and in use value. This is not the case. Ricardo is not an optimist who believes in such fairy tales. But because for Ricardo, the rate of profit and the rate of surplus value, that is, the relative surplus value, since he assumes the length of the working day to be constant, are identical terms, a permanent fall in profit, or the tendency of profit to fall, can only be explained as the result of the same causes that bring about a permanent fall or tendency to fall in the rate of surplus value, i.e. in that part of the day during which the worker does not work for himself, but for the capitalist. What are these causes? If the length of the working day is assumed to remain constant, then the part of it during which the worker works for nothing for the capitalist can only fall or diminish if the part during which he works for himself grows. And since this is only possible, assuming that labor is paid at its value, if the value of the necessaries, the means of subsistence on which the worker spends his wages, increases. But as a result of the development of the productivity of labor, the value of industrial commodities is constantly decreasing. The diminishing rate of profit can therefore only be explained by the fact that the value of food, the principal component of the means of subsistence, is constantly rising. This happens because agriculture is becoming less productive. This is the same presupposition which, according to Ricardo's interpretation, explains the existence and growth of rent. The continuous fall in profits is thus bound up with the continuous rise in the rate of rent. I have already shown that Ricardo's view of rent is wrong. This then cuts out one of the grounds for his explanation of the fall in the rate of profits. But secondly, it rests on the false assumption that the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit are identical, that therefore a fall in the rate of profit is identical with a fall in the rate of surplus value, which in fact could only be explained in Ricardo's way. And this puts an end to his theory. The rate of profit falls, although the rate of surplus value remains the same or even rises, because the proportion of variable capital to constant capital decreases with the development of the productive power of labor. The rate of profit thus falls not because labor becomes less productive, but because it becomes more productive. Not because the worker is less exploited, but because he is more exploited. Whether the absolute surplus time grows, or when the state prevents this, the relative surplus time grows, for capitalist production is inseparable from falling relative value of labor. Thus, Ricardo's theory rests on two false presuppositions. One, the false supposition that the existence and growth of rent is determined by the diminishing productivity of agriculture, and two, the false assumption that the rate of profit is equal to the rate of relative surplus value, and can only rise or fall in inverse proportion to a fall or rise of wages. I shall now place together the statements in which Ricardo expounds the view that has just been described. Subsection B. Analysis of Ricardo's thesis that the increasing rent gradually absorbs the profit. First, however, some comments on the way in which, given his concept of rent, Ricardo thinks that rent gradually swallows up the rate of profit. We shall use the tables on page 574, but with the necessary modifications. In these tables, it is assumed that the capital employed consists of 60 constant and 40 variable, that surplus value is 50%, the value of the product is therefore 120, whatever the productivity of labor. Of this, 10 pounds was profit and 10 absolute rent. Say the 40 pounds represents wages for 20 men, for a week's labor for example, or rather, because of the rate of profit, say a year's labor, but this does not matter here at all. According to Table A, where land number 1 determines the market value, the number of tons is 60, therefore 60 tons equals 120 pounds. 1 ton is 120 over 60, being 2 pounds. The wages, 40 pounds, are thus equal to 20 tons, or quarters of grain. This then is the necessary wage for the number of workers employed by the capital of 100 pounds. Now if it were necessary to descend to an inferior type of soil, where a capital of 110 pounds was required, being 60 constant and 50 variable, in order to produce 48 tons. In this case, the surplus value would be 10 pounds, and the price per ton would be 2.5 pounds. If we descended to an even worse type of land, where 120 pounds would be equal to 40 tons, the price per ton would be 120 over 40, being 3 pounds. In this case, there would be no surplus value on the worst type of land. What the 20 men produce is always equal to the value of 60 pounds. 3 pounds equals a working day of a given length. Thus, if wages grow from 40 pounds to 60, the surplus value disappears altogether. It is assumed throughout that 1/4 is the necessary wage for one man. Assume that in both these cases, a capital of only 100 pounds is to be laid out, or, which is the same thing, whatever capital may be laid out, what is the proportion for 100? For instead of calculating that if the same number of workers and the same constant capital is employed as before, the capital outlay will amount to 110 or 120, we shall calculate on the basis of the same organic composition how much constant capital and wages a capital of 100 pounds contains, in order to keep to the comparison of 100 with the other classes. The proportion 110 to 60 equals 100 to 54 and 6/11ths, and 110 to 50 equals 100 to 45 and 5/11ths. 20 men set in motion 60 pounds constant capital, so how many men set in motion 54 and 6/11ths? The situation is as follows. The value obtained from employing a number of workers, say 20, is 60 pounds. In this case, 20 quarters or tons equal to 40 pounds will fall to the share of the workers employed, if the value of the ton or quarter is 2 pounds. If the value of a ton rises to 3 pounds, the surplus value disappears. If it rises to 2.5, then that half of the surplus value disappears, which constituted the absolute rent. In the first case, where capital of 120 pounds, being 60 constant and 60 variable, is laid out, the product amounts to 120 pounds, that is, 40 tons, as 40 times 3. In the second case, where capital of 110 pounds, being 60 constant and 50 variable, is laid out, the product also amounts to 120 pounds, which is 48 tons, being 48 times 2.5. In the first case, if the capital laid out were 100 pounds, being 50 constant and 50 variable, the product would come to 100, i.e. 33 1/3 tons, where 3 times 33 1/3 equal 100. Moreover, since only the land has deteriorated, while the capital has undergone no change, the proportionate number of workers who set in motion the constant capital of 50 pounds will be the same as that previously setting in motion the capital of 60. Thus, if the latter was set in motion by 20 men, who received 40 pounds while the value of 1 ton was 2 pounds, it will now be set in motion by 16 2/3 men, who receive 50 pounds since the value of a ton has risen to 3. As before, one man receives 1 ton or 1/4, equal to 3 pounds, for 16 2/3 times 3 equals 50. If the value created by 16 2/3 men is 50 pounds, then that created by 20 men is 60 pounds. Thus, the assumption that a day's labor of 20 men is equal to 60 pounds remains unchanged. Now let us take the second case. With the capital outlay of 100 pounds, the product is 109 1/11 pounds, equal to 43 7/11 tons, where 2.5 times 43 7/11 equals 109 1/11. The constant capital is 54 6/11 pounds, and the variable is 45 5/11. How many men does the 45 5/11 pounds represent? 18 2/11 men. For if the value of a day's labor of 20 men equals 60 pounds, then that of 18 2/11 men equals 54 6/11 pounds. Hence the value of the product is 109 1/11. It can be seen that in both cases, the same capital sets in motion fewer men, who, however, cost more. They work for the same length of time, but the surplus labor time decreases or disappears altogether, because they produce a smaller amount of product in the same time, and this product consists of their necessaries. Therefore, they use more labor time for the production of 1 ton or 1/4, although they work the same length of time as before. In his calculations, Ricardo always presupposes that the capital must set in motion more labor, and that therefore a greater capital, i.e. of 120 pounds or 110, must be laid out instead of the previous 100. This is only correct if the same quantity is to be produced, i.e. 60 tons in the cases cited above, instead of 40 tons being produced in case number 1 with an outlay of 120, and 48 in case number 2 with an outlay of 110. With an outlay of 100, therefore, 33 1/3 tons are produced in case number 1, and 43 7/11 tons in the case number 2. Ricardo thus departs from the correct viewpoint, which is not that more workers must be employed in order to create the same product, but that a given number of workers create a smaller product, a greater share of which is in turn taken up by wages. We shall now compile 2 tables, firstly Table A from page 574, and the new table, which follows from the data given above. The aforementioned graphics will not be read aloud for the recording. Please consult Subsection B of Section 3 of Chapter 16 in a physical or digital copy of the book for visual reference. If this table were constructed in the reverse direction, according to Ricardo's descending line, that is beginning from number 3, and if at the same time one assumed that the more fertile land which is cultivated first pays no rent, then we would, in the first place, have a capital of £100 in number 3, which produces a value of £120, consisting of £60 constant capital and £60 newly added labor. According to Ricardo, one would further have to assume that the rate of profit stood at a higher level than entered in Table A, since, when the ton of coal or quarter of wheat was £2, the 20 men received 20 tons, equal to £40. Now that, as a result of the fall in the value, the ton is equal to 1 9/15 pounds, or £1 and 12 shillings, the 20 men receive only £32, equal to 20 tons. The capital advanced to employ the same number of workers would amount to £60 constant and £32 variable, totaling 92, and the produced value would be 120, since the value of the work carried out by the 20 men equals £60 as before. Accordingly, a capital of £100 would produce a value of 130 and 10/23 pounds, for 92 is to 120 as 100 is to 130 and 10/23, or 23 is to 30 as 100 is to 130 and 10/23. Moreover, this capital of £100 would be composed as follows: 65 and 5/23 constant and 34 and 18/23 variable. Thus the capital would be the sum of these two. The value of the product would amount to 130 and 10/23 pounds. The number of workers would be 21 and 17/23, and the rate of surplus value 87 and 1/2%. So we would have the following table. Expressed in tons, wages would be equal to 21 and 17/23 tons, and profit to 19 and 146 tons. Continuing on the Ricardian assumption, let us now suppose that as a result of the increasing population, the market price rises so high that class number 2 must be cultivated, where the value per ton is 1 and 11/13 pounds. In this case, it is impossible to assume, as Ricardo wants, that the 21 and 17/23 workers produce always the same value, i.e. 65 and 5/23 pounds, wages added to surplus value. For the number of workers whom number 3 can employ, and therefore exploit, decreases, according to his own assumption, hence also the total amount of surplus value. At the same time, the composition of the agricultural capital always remains the same. Whatever their wages may be, 20 workers are always required, with a given length of the working day, in order to set in motion 60 pounds constant capital. Since these 20 workers receive 20 tons, and the ton is equal to 1 and 11/13 pounds, 20 workers cost 36 and 12/13 pounds. The value which these 20 workers produce, whatever the productivity of their labor, equals 60 pounds. Thus, the capital advanced amounts to 96 and 12/13. The value of the product is 120, and the profit 23 and 1/13 pounds. The profit on a capital of £100 will therefore be 23 and 17/21, and the composition, 61 and 19/21 constant, plus 38 and 2/21 variable. 20 and 40/63 workers are employed. Since the total value is 123 and 17/21 pounds, and the individual value per ton in class number 3 is 1 3/5 pounds, of how many tons does the product consist? 77 and 8/21 tons. The rate of surplus value is 62.5%. But number 3 sells the ton at 1 11/13 pounds. This results in a differential value of 4 12/13 shillings, or 16/65 of a pound per ton, and on 77 and 8/21 tons, it amounts to 19 and 1/21 pounds. Instead of selling its product at 123 and 17/21 pounds, number 3 sells it at 123 and 17/21, plus 19 and 1/21 being 142 and 6/7 pounds. The 19 and 1/21 pounds constitutes the rent. Thus, we would have the following table for number 3. The wages measured in tons are 20 and 40/63 tons, and the profit is 12 and 113/126 tons. We now pass on to class number 2. There is no rent here. Market value and individual value are equal. The number of tons produced by number 2 is 67 and 4/63. Thus, we have the following table for number 2. Wages measured in tons are 20 and 40/63, and profit is 12 and 113 over 126 tons. For the second case, in which class number 2 and rent come into existence, we have the following table. Let us now pass on to the third case, and like Ricardo, let us assume that mine number 1, a poorer mine, must and can be worked, because the market value has risen to £2. Since 20 workers are required for a constant capital of £60, and their wages are now £40, we have the same composition of capital as in Table A on page 574, i.e. 60 constant and 40 variable, and as the value produced by the 20 workers is always equal to £60, the total value of the product produced by a capital of 100 is 120, whatever its productivity. The rate of profit in this case is 20%, and the surplus value 50%. Measured in tons, the profit is 10 tons. We must now see what changes occur in number 3 and number 2 as a result of this change in the market value and the introduction of number 1, which determines the rate of profit. Although number 3 works the most fertile land, he can, with £100, only employ 20 workers, costing him £40. For a constant capital of £60 requires 20 workers. The number of workers employed with a capital of 100 therefore falls to 20, and the actual total value of the product is now 120. The number of tons produced by number 3 decreases because he can employ less labor with the same capital, not more, as Ricardo wrongly declares, because he always considers merely how much labor is required in order to create the same output, not how much living labor can be employed with the new composition of capital, though this is the only important point. But he sells these 75 tons at £150 instead of at 120, which is their value, and so the rent rises to £30 in number 3. So far as number 2 is concerned, the value of the product here is also £120. But as the individual value per ton is 1 and 11/13 pounds, 65 tons are produced. In short, we arrive here at Table A. But since for our purpose, we need new headings here, now that number 1 is introduced and the market value has risen to £2, we set out the table again. Let us now go on to the newly assumed cases. First of all, the class which still yields a profit. Let it be called 1B. With a capital of £100, it only yields 43 and 7/11 tons. The value of a ton has risen to £2.5. The composition of the capital is 54 and 6/11 constant plus 45 and 5/11 variable. The value of the product is 109 and 1/11 pounds. 45 and 5/11 is enough to pay 18 and 2/11 men. And since the value of a day's labor of 20 men is £60, that of 18 and 2/11 men is 54 and 6/11. The value of the product is therefore 109 and 1/11 pounds. The rate of profit is 9 and 1/11 pounds, that is 3 and 7/11 tons. The rate of surplus value is 20%. Since the organic composition of the capitals in 3, 2, and 1 is the same as in 1B, and they must pay the same wages, they too can employ only 18 and 2/11 men with £100. These men produce a total value of 54 and 6/11, and therefore a surplus value of 20% and a rate of profit of 9 and 1/11% as in 1B. The total value of the product here, as in 1B, is 109 and 1/11 pounds. But since the individual value of a ton in number 3 is 1 3/5 pounds, number 3 produces, or its product is equal to, 109 and 1/11 divided by 1 3/5, or 68 and 2/11 tons. Moreover, the difference between the market value of a ton and the individual value amounts to 18 shillings, and on 68 and 2/11 tons, this amounts to £617 and 3/11 of a shilling. Instead of selling it at 109 and 1/11 pounds, number 3 sells it at £170 and 9 5/11 of a shilling, and this excess equals the rent of number 3. This rent, expressed in tons, is 24 and 6/11 tons. Since the individual value of a ton in number 2 is 1 and 11/13 pounds, number 2 produces 109 and 1/11 divided by 1 and 11/13, and this is 59 and 1/11 tons. The difference between the market value of 1 ton in number 2 and its individual value is 17/26 of a pound. And on 59 and 1/11 tons, this amounts to 38 and 7/11 pounds, and this is the rent. The total market value of the product amounts to 147 and 8/11 pounds. The rent, expressed in tons, is 15 and 5/11 tons. Finally, since the individual value of a ton in number 1 is 2 pounds, 109 and 1/11 pounds is equal to 54 and 6/11 tons. The difference between the market value and the individual value is 10 shillings. And on 54 and 6/11 tons, this amounts to 27 pounds and 5 and 5/11 shillings. The total market value of the product is therefore 136 pounds and 7 and 3/11 shillings, and the value of the rent expressed in tons is 10 and 10/11 tons. Bringing together all the data for case number 4, one gets the following table. Finally, let us look at the last case, in which, according to Ricardo, the entire profit disappears, and there is no surplus value. In this case, the value of the product rises to 3 pounds, so that if 20 men are employed, their wage is 60 pounds, which is equal to the value produced by them. The composition of the capital is 50 constant and 50 variable. Now 16 and 2/3 men are employed. If the value produced by 20 men is 60 pounds, then that produced by 16 and 2/3 men is 50 pounds. The wages, therefore, swallow up the whole value. Now, as before, a man receives 1 ton. The value of the product is 100 pounds, and therefore the number of tons produced is 33 1/3, of which 1/2 merely replace the value of the constant capital, and the other half the value of the variable capital. Since in number 3, the individual value of the ton is 1 3/5 pounds, how many tons does number 3 produce? 100 divided by 1 3/5, i.e. 62.5 tons, whose value is 100 pounds. The difference, however, between market value and individual value is 1 6/15 pounds. On 62.5 tons, this amounts to 87 1/2 pounds. Hence, the total market value of the product is 187.5 pounds, and the rent in tons is 29 1/6 tons. In number 2, the individual value of a ton is 1 11/13 pounds. Hence, the differential value is 1 2/13 pounds. Since the individual value of a ton is here 1 11/13 pounds, the capital of 100 pounds produces 54 1/6 tons. On this number of tons, that difference amounts to 62 pounds and 10 shillings, and the total market value of the product is 162 pounds and 10 shillings. Expressed in tons, the rent is 20 5/6 tons. In number 1, the individual value of a ton is 2 pounds. The differential value therefore equals 1 pound. Since the individual value of a ton is 2 pounds here, a capital of 100 pounds produces 50 tons. This makes a difference of 50 pounds. The total market value of the product is 150, and the rent in tons is 16 2/3 tons. We now come to 1b, which until now has not carried a rent. Here, the individual value is 2.5 pounds. Hence, differential value equals 1/2 pound or 10 shillings. And since the individual value of a ton is here equal to 2.5 pounds, 100 pounds produces 40 tons. The differential value on these is 20 pounds, so that the total market value of the product amounts to 120, and the rent expressed in tons is 6 2/3 tons. Let us now construct case number 5, in which, according to Ricardo, profit disappears. On the following page, I shall now put all 5 cases in tabular form. Subsection C. Transformation of a part of profit and a part of capital into rent. The magnitude of rent varies in accordance with the amount of labor employed in agriculture. If in the first place we examine Table E on the previous page, we see that the position in the last class, 1a, is very clear. In this case, wages swallow up the whole product and the whole value of the newly added labor. Surplus value is non-existent, hence there is neither profit nor rent. The value of the product is equal to the value of the capital advanced, so that the workers, who are here in possession of their own capital, can invariably reproduce their wages in the conditions of their labor, but no more. In this last class, it cannot be said that the rent swallows up the profit. There is no rent and no profit because there is no surplus value. Wages swallow up the surplus value, and therefore the profit. In the 4 other classes, the position is at first glance by no means clear. If there is no surplus value, how can rent exist? Moreover, the productivity of labor on the types of land 1b, 1, 2, and 3 has not altered at all. The non-existence of surplus value must therefore be sheer illusion. Furthermore, another phenomenon becomes apparent, and this, at first glance, is equally inexplicable. The rent in tons for number 3 amounts to 29 1/6 tons or quarters, whereas in Table A, where only land 3 was cultivated, where there was no rent, and where moreover 21 17/23 men were employed, whereas now only 16 2/3 men are employed, the profit, which absorbed the entire surplus value, only amounted to 19 1/46 tons. The same contradiction is apparent in number 2, where the rent in Table E amounts to 20 5/6 tons or quarters, while in Table B the profit, which absorbed the entire surplus value, 20 40/63 men being employed, instead of 16 2/3 men now, amounted to only 12 113/126 tons, or quarters. Similarly in number 1, where the rent in Table E is 16 2/3 tons or quarters, while in Table C, the profit of number 1, which absorbs the entire surplus value, is only 10 tons, 20 men being employed instead of the present 16 2/3. Finally, in 1B, where the rent in Table E is 6 2/3 tons or quarters, while the profit of 1B in Table D, where the profit absorbed the entire surplus value, was only 3 7/11 tons or quarters, while 18 2/11 men were employed instead of the 16 2/3 now being employed. It is, however, clear that whereas the rise in market value above the individual value of the products of 3, 2, 1, and 1B can alter the distribution of the product, shifting it from one class of shareholders to the other, it can by no means increase the product, which represents the surplus value, over and above the wages. Since the productivity of the various types of land has remained the same, as has the productivity of capital, how can number 3 to number 1B become more productive in tons or quarters through the entry into the market of the less productive type of land or mine 1A? The riddle is solved in the following manner. If a day's labor of 20 men produces 60 pounds, then that of 16 2/3 men produces 50. And since in land of class number 3, the labor time contained in 1 3/5 pounds is represented in 1 ton or 1/4, 50 pounds will be represented in 5 3/4 tons or quarters. 16 2/3 tons or quarters have to be deducted from this for wages, thus leaving 14 7/12 as surplus value. Furthermore, because the market value of a ton has risen from 1 3/5 pounds to 3 pounds, 16 2/3 tons out of the product of 62.5 tons will suffice to replace the value of the constant capital. On the other hand, so long as the ton or quarter produced on number 3 itself determined the market value, and the latter was therefore equal to its individual value, 31 1/4 tons were required in order to replace a constant capital of 50. Instead of the 31 1/4 tons, the part of the product which was necessary to replace the capital when the value of a ton was 1 3/5 pounds, only 16 2/3 are now required. Thus 31 1/4 minus 16 2/3, i.e. 14 7/12 tons, become available and fall to the share of rent. If one now adds the surplus value produced by 16 2/3 workers with a constant capital of 50 pounds on number 3, which amounts to 14 7/12 tons, to the part of the product which instead of replacing the constant capital now takes on the form of surplus produce, then the total surplus produce amounts to 29 1/6 tons. And this is exactly the rent of number 3 in Table E. The apparent contradiction in the amount of rent in classes 3, 1, and 1B in Table E is solved in exactly the same way. Thus, it becomes evident that the differential rent, which arises on the better types of land owing to the difference between market value and individual value of the products raised on them, in its material form as rent in kind, surplus product, rent in tons or corn in the above example, is made up of two elements and due to two transformations. Firstly, the surplus product, which represents the surplus labor of the workers, or surplus value, is changed from the form of profit to the form of rent, and therefore falls to the landlord instead of the capitalist. Secondly, a part of the product which previously, when the product of the better type of land or mine was being sold at its own value, was needed to replace the value of the constant capital, is now, when each portion of the product possesses a higher market value, free, and appears in the form of surplus product, thus falling to the landlord instead of the capitalist. The rent in kind, insofar as it is differential rent, comes into being as the result of two processes: the transformation of the surplus produce into rent and not into profit, and the transformation of a portion of the product, which was previously allotted for replacement of the value of the constant capital, into surplus product, and thus into rent. The latter circumstance, that a part of the product is converted into rent instead of capital, has been overlooked by Ricardo and all his followers. They only see the transformation of surplus product into rent, but not the transformation of a part of the product which previously fell to the share of capital, not of profit, into surplus product. The nominal value of the surplus product, or differential rent thus constituted, is determined, according to the presupposition made, by the value of the product produced on the worst land, or in the worst mine. But this market value only instigates the different distribution of this product. It does not bring it about. These same two elements are present in all excess profit. For instance, if as a result of new machinery, etc., a cheaply produced product is sold at a higher market value than its own value, a part of the surplus labor of the workers appears as surplus product, that is, excess profit, instead of as profit. And a part of the product which, if the product were sold at its own lower value, would have to replace the value of the capitalist's constant capital, now becomes free, has not got to replace anything, becomes surplus product, and therefore swells the profit. Incidentally, when speaking of the law of the falling rate of profit in the course of development of capitalist production, we mean by profit the total sum of surplus value which is seized in the first place by the industrial capitalist, irrespective of how he may have to share this later with the money-lending capitalist in the form of interest and the landlord in the form of rent. Thus here, the rate of profit is equal to surplus value divided by the capital outlay. The rate of profit in this sense may fall, although, for instance, the industrial profit rises proportionately to interest, or vice versa, or although rent rises proportionately to industrial profit, or vice versa. If P is the profit, P prime the industrial profit, I interest, and R rent, then P is equal to P prime plus I plus R. And it is clear that whatever the absolute magnitude of P, P prime, I, and R can increase or decrease as compared with one another, independently of the magnitude of P, or the rise and fall of P. The reciprocal rise of P prime, I, and R only represents an altered distribution of P among different persons. A further examination of the circumstances on which this distribution of P depends, but which does not coincide with the rise or fall of P itself, does not belong here, but into a consideration of the competition between capitals. That, however, R can rise to a level higher even than that of P, if it were only divided into P prime and I, is therefore, as has already been explained, due to an illusion which arises from the fact that a part of the product whose value is rising becomes free, and is converted into rent instead of being reconverted into constant capital. It was assumed throughout this discussion that the product whose price, according to market value, had risen did not enter in kind into the composition of the constant capital, but only into wages, only into the variable capital. If the former were the case, Ricardo says that this would cause the rate of profit to fall even more and the rent to rise. This has to be examined. We have assumed until now that the value of the product has to replace the value of the constant capital, i.e. the 50 pounds in the case cited above. Thus, if 1 ton or quarter costs 3 pounds, it is obvious that not so many tons or quarters are required for the replacement of this value than would be needed if the ton or quarter cost only 1 9/15 pounds. But supposing that the coal, or the corn, or whatever other product of the earth, the product produced by agricultural capital, itself enters in kind into the formation of the constant capital. Let us assume, for instance, that it makes up half of the constant capital. In this case, it is clear that whatever the price of the coal or the corn, a constant capital of a definite size, in other words, one which is set in motion by a definite number of workers, always requires a definite portion of the total product in kind for its replacement, since the composition of agricultural capital has, according to the assumption, remained unchanged in its proportionate amounts of accumulated and living labor. If, for example, half the constant capital consists of coal or corn and half of other commodities, then the constant capital of 50 pounds will consist of 25 pounds of other commodities and 25 pounds coal or corn. That would be 15 5/8 quarters if the value of a ton was 1 3/5 pounds. And however the market value of a ton or quarter may change, 16 2/3 men require a constant capital of 25 pounds plus 15 5/8 quarters or tons, for the nature of the constant capital remains the same, and so does the proportionate number of workers required to set it in motion. Now if, as in Table E, the value of a ton or quarter rises to 3 pounds, then the constant capital required for the 16 2/3 men would be 71 7/8 pounds. And since the 16 2/3 men cost 50 pounds, they would require a total capital outlay of 121 7/8 pounds. The correlation of values within the agricultural capital would have changed, while organic composition remained the same. It would be 71 7/8 pounds constant, plus 50 pounds variable. For 100 pounds, the composition would be 58 38/39 constant, plus 41 1/39 variable. Slightly more than 13 2/3 workers. Since 16 and 2/3 workers set in motion 15 and 5/8 tons or quarters constant capital, 13 and 79 over 117 workers set in motion 12 and 32/39 tons or quarters, equal to 38 and 6/13 pounds. The remainder of the constant capital, equal to 20 and 20/39 pounds, would consist of other commodities. Whatever the circumstances, 12 and 32/39 tons would always have to be deducted from the product in order to replace that part of constant capital into which they enter in kind. Since the value produced by 20 workers equals 60 pounds, that produced by 13 and 79 117ths equals 41 and 139 pounds. Wages in Table E, however, also amount to 41 and 139 pounds, therefore no surplus value. The total number of tons would be 15 and 11/13ths, of which 12 and 32/39 tons are needed to replace part of the constant capital in kind. A further 13 and 79 over 117 are for the workers. 6 and 98 over 117 tons, at 3 pounds a ton, are used to replace the remainder of the constant capital. That is altogether 33 and a third tons. This would leave 17 and 37/39 tons for rent. To shorten the matter, let us take the most extreme case, the one most favorable to Ricardo, i.e. that the constant capital, just as the variable, consists purely of agricultural produce, whose value rises to 3 pounds per quarter or ton, when Class 1A governs the market. The technological composition of the capital remains the same, that is, the ratio between living labor, or number of workers represented by the variable capital, and the quantity of the instruments of labor required, which now, according to our assumption, consists of tons of coal or quarters of corn. Since with the original composition of the capital, of 60 constant and 40 variable, and the price per ton of 2 pounds, 40 variable represented 20 workers, or 20 quarters, or tons, 60 pounds constant capital represented 30 tons, and since these 20 workers produced 75 tons on number 3, 13 and a third workers, and 40 pounds variable is equal to 13 and a third tons or workers if the ton costs 3 pounds, produce 50 tons, and set in motion a constant capital equal to 20 tons or quarters. Moreover, since 20 workers produce a value of 60 pounds, 13 and a third workers produce 40. Since the capitalists must pay 60 pounds for the 20 tons and 40 pounds for the 13 and a third workers, but the latter only produce a value of 40 pounds, the value of the product is 100. The outlay is 100. Surplus value and profit are nil. But because the productivity of number 3 has remained the same, as has already been said, 13 and the third men produce 50 tons or quarters. The outlay in kind, however, only amounts to 20 tons for constant capital and 13 and a third tons for wages, i.e. 33 and a third tons. The 50 tons thus leave a surplus product of 16 and 2/3, and this forms the rent. But what do the 16 and 2/3 represent? Since the value of the product is 100 pounds, and the product itself equals 50 tons, the value of the ton produced here would be in fact 2 pounds, which is 100 over 50. And so long as the product in kind is greater than what is required for the replacement of the capital in kind, the individual value of a ton must remain smaller than its market value, according to this criterion. The farmer must pay 60 pounds in order to replace the 20 tons constant capital, and he reckons the 20 tons at 3 pounds, since this is the market value per ton, and a ton is sold at this price. Similarly, he must pay 40 pounds for the 13 and the third workers, or for the tons or quarters which he pays to the workers. Thus the workers only receive 13 and a third tons in the transaction. In actual fact, however, so far as class number 3 is concerned, the 20 tons cost 40 pounds, and the 13 and the third cost only 26 and 2/3 pounds. But the 13 and the third workers produce a value of 40, and therefore a surplus value of 131 over 3. At 2 pounds per ton, this amounts to 64 over 6, or 32 over 3 tons. And since the 20 tons constant capital cost only 40 pounds on number 3, this leaves an excess of 20 pounds, equal to 10 tons. The 16 and 2/3 tons rent are thus equal to 6 and 2/3 tons surplus value, which is converted into rent, and 10 tons capital, which is converted into rent. But because the market value per ton has risen to 3 pounds, the 20 tons cost the farmer 60 pounds, and the 13 and the third cost him 40. While the 16 and 2/3, that is the excess of the market value over the individual value of his product, appear as rent and cost 50 pounds. How many tons are produced by 13 and the third men in class 2? 20 men produce 65 here. 13 and the third men therefore produced 43 and a third tons. The value of the product is 100 pounds, as above. Of the 43 and a third tons, however, 33 and a third are required for the replacement of the capital. This leaves 10 tons as surplus product, or rent. But this rent of 10 tons can be explained as follows. The value of the product of number 2 is 100 pounds. The product amounts to 43 1/3 tons. Thus, the value of a ton is 2 4/13 pounds. The 13 1/3 workers therefore cost 30 10/13 pounds, and this leaves a surplus value of 9 3/13 pounds. Only in Class 1A, where in fact 33 1/3 tons or quarters, that is the total product, is required in kind to replace constant capital and wages, there is neither surplus value, nor surplus product, nor profit, nor rent. So long as this is not the case, so long as the product is greater than is necessary to replace the capital in kind, there will be conversion of profit and capital into rent. Conversion of capital into rent takes place when a part of the product is freed, which, with a lower value, would have had to replace the capital, or when a part of the product which would have been converted into capital and surplus value falls to rent. At the same time, it is evident that if constant capital becomes dearer as a result of dearer agricultural produce, then rent is very much reduced. For example, the rent of number 3 and number 2 is reduced from 50 tons, equal to 150 pounds with a market value of 3 pounds, to 26 2/3 tons, i.e. almost by half. Such a reduction is inevitable, since the number of workers employed with the same capital of 100 pounds is reduced for two reasons. Firstly, because wages rise, i.e. the value of the variable capital rises. Secondly, because the value of the means of production, the constant capital, rises. In itself, the rise in wages necessitates that out of the 100 pounds, less can be laid out in labor. Hence, relatively less can be laid out in constant capital. Thus, 100 pounds represents less accumulated and less living labor. In addition, however, the rise in the value of the commodities which enter into the constant capital reduces the amount of accumulated labor, and for this reason of living labor, which can be employed for the same sum of money, as the technological ratio between accumulated and living labor remains the same. But since, with the same productivity of the land and a given technological composition of the capital, the total product depends on the quantity of labor employed, as the latter decreases, so the rent must also decrease. This only becomes evident when profit disappears. So long as there is a profit, the rent can increase despite the absolute decrease in the product in all classes, as shown in the table on page 681. It is after all obvious that as soon as rent alone exists, the decrease in the product, hence in the surplus product, must hit rent itself. This would occur more rapidly at the outset if the value of the constant capital increased with that of the variable capital. But this apart, the table on page 681 shows that with declining fertility in agriculture, the growth of differential rent is always accompanied, even on the better classes of land, by a diminishing volume of total product in proportion to a capital outlay of a definite size, say 100 pounds. Ricardo has no inkling of this. The rate of profit decreases because the same capital, say 100 pounds, sets in motion less labor and pays more for this labor, thus yielding an ever smaller surplus. The actual product, however, like the surplus value, depends on the number of workers employed by the capital when the productivity is given. This is overlooked by Ricardo. He also ignores the manner in which the rent is formed, not only by transforming surplus value into rent, but also capital into surplus value. Of course, this is only an apparent transformation of capital into surplus value. Each particle of surplus produce would represent surplus value or surplus labor if the market value were determined by the value of the product of number 3, etc. Ricardo, moreover, only considers that in order to produce the same volume of product, more labor has to be employed, but disregards the fact that with the same capital, an ever-diminishing quantity of living labor is employed, of which an ever greater part is necessary labor, and an ever smaller part surplus labor, and this is the decisive factor for the determination of both the rate of profit and the quantity of product produced. All this considered, it must be said that even if rent is taken to be purely differential rent, Ricardo has not made the slightest advance over his predecessors. His important achievement in this field is, as De Quincey pointed out, the scientific formulation of the question. In solving it, Ricardo accepts the traditional views. Namely, quote, "The innovation that Ricardo introduced into the theory of rent is that he resolves it into the question whether it really invalidates the law of value. Rent is that portion of the produce from the soil or from any agency of production which is paid to the landlord for the use of its differential powers, as measured by comparison with those of similar agents operating on the same market. The objections against Ricardo are that the owners of number 1 will not give it away for nothing. But in the period, this mythical period, when only number 1 is being cultivated, no separate class of occupants and tenants distinct from the class of owners can have been formed. End quote from De Quincey. So according to De Quincey, this law of land ownership is valid so long as there is no land ownership in the modern sense of the word. Now to the relevant quotations from Ricardo. Subsection D. Historical illustration of the rise in the rate of profit with a simultaneous rise in the prices of agricultural products. The possibility of an increasing productivity of labor in agriculture. First, the following note on differential rent. In reality, the ascending and descending lines alternate, run across one another, and intertwine. But it cannot by any means be said that if for individual short periods, such as 1797 to 1813, the descending line clearly predominates, that because of this, the rate of profit must fall, insofar that is, as the latter is determined by the rate of surplus value. Rather, I believe that during that period, the rate of profit in England rose by way of exception, despite the greatly increased prices of wheat and agricultural produce generally. I do not know of any English statistician who does not share this view on the rise in the rate of profit during that period. Individual economists, such as Chalmers, Blake, etc., have advanced special theories based on this fact. Moreover, I must add that it is foolish to attempt to explain the rise in the price of wheat during that period by the depreciation of money. No one who has studied the history of the prices of commodities during that period can agree with this. Besides, the rise in prices begins much earlier and reaches a high level before any kind of depreciation of money occurs. As soon as it appears, it must simply be allowed for. If one asks why the rate of profit rose despite the rising corn prices, this is to be explained from the following circumstances. Prolongation of the working day, the direct consequence of the newly introduced machinery, depreciation of the manufactured goods and colonial commodities which enter into the consumption of the workers, reduction of wages, although the nominal wages rose, below their traditional average level. This fact is acknowledged for that period. J.P. Sterling, in The Philosophy of Trade, etc., published in Edinburgh in 1846, who, on the whole, accepts Ricardo's theory of rent, seeks, however, to prove that the immediate consequence of a permanent rise in the price of corn is always the reduction in the average wage. Finally, the rise in the rate of profit was due to rising nominal prices of commodities, because loans and government expenditure increased the demand for capital even more rapidly than its supply, and this enabled the manufacturers to retrieve part of the product paid to the landowning rentiers and other persons who have a fixed income in the form of rent, etc. This transaction is of no concern to us here, where we are considering the basic relationships, and therefore are concerned only with 3 classes: landlords, capitalists, and workmen. On the other hand, it plays a significant part in practice, under appropriate circumstances, as Blake has shown. Mr. Hallett from Brighton exhibited pedigree nursery wheat at the 1862 exhibition. Mr. Hallett insists that ears of corn, like racehorses, must be carefully reared, instead of, as is done ordinarily, grown in higgledy-piggledy fashion, with no regard to the theory of natural selection. In illustration of what good education may do, even with wheat, some remarkable examples are given. In 1857, Mr. Hallett planted the grains of an ear of the first quality of the red wheat, exactly 4 3/8 inches long, and containing 47 grains. From the product of the small crops ensuing, he again selected, in 1858, the finest ear, 6 1/2 inches long, and with 79 grains, and this was repeated. In 1859, again with the best offspring, this time 7 3/4 inches long and containing 91 grains. The next year, 1860, was a bad season for agricultural education, and the wheat refused to grow any bigger and better. But the year after, 1861, the best ear came to be 8 3/4 inches long, with no less than 123 grains on the single stalk. Thus the wheat had increased in 5 years to very nearly double its size, and to a 3-fold amount of productiveness in number of grains. These results were obtained by what Mr. Hallett calls the natural system of cultivating wheat, that is, the planting of single grains at such a distance, about 9 inches from each other each way, as to afford each sufficient space for full development. He asserts that the corn produce of England may be doubled by adopting pedigree wheat and the natural system of cultivation. He states that from single grains, planted at the proper time, one only on each square foot of ground, he obtained plants consisting of 23 ears on the average, with about 36 grains in each ear. The produce of an acre at this rate was, accurately counted, 1,001,880 ears of wheat, while when sown in the ordinary fashion, with an expenditure of more than 20 times the amount of seed, the crop amounted to only 934,120 ears of corn, or 67,760 ears less. Subsection E. Ricardo's explanation for the fall in the rate of profit, and its connection with his theory of rent. Ricardo establishes the fall in the rate of profit as follows. With the progress of society, the natural price of labor has always a tendency to rise, because one of the principal commodities by which its natural price is regulated has a tendency to become dearer, from the greater difficulty of producing it. As, however, the improvements in agriculture, the discovery of new markets whence provisions may be imported, may for a time counteract the tendency to a rise in the price of necessaries, and may even occasion their natural price to fall, so will the same causes produce the correspondent effects on the natural price of labor. The natural price of all commodities, excepting raw produce and labor, has a tendency to fall in the progress of wealth and population. For though, on the one hand, they are enhanced in real value from the rise in natural price of the raw material of which they are made, this is more than counterbalanced by the improvements in machinery, by the better division and distribution of labor, and by the increasing skill, both in science and art, of the producers. As population increases, these necessaries will be constantly rising in price, because more labor will be necessary to produce them. Instead, therefore, of the money wages of labor falling, they would rise, but they would not rise sufficiently to enable the laborer to purchase as many comforts and necessaries as he did before the rise in price of those commodities. Notwithstanding, then, that the laborer would be really worse paid, yet this increase in his wages would necessarily diminish the profits of the manufacturer, for his goods would sell at no higher price, and yet the expense of producing them would be increased. It appears, then, that the same cause which raises rent, the increasing difficulty of providing an additional quantity of food with the same proportional quantity of labor, will also raise wages, and therefore, if money be of an unvarying value, both rent and wages will have a tendency to rise with the progress of wealth and population. But there is this essential difference between the rise of rent and the rise of wages. The rise in the money value of rent is accompanied by an increased share of the produce. Not only is the landlord's money rent greater, but his corn rent also. The fate of the laborer will be less happy. He will receive more money wages, it is true, but his corn wages will be reduced. And not only his command of corn, but his general condition will be deteriorated, by his finding it more difficult to maintain the market rate of wages above their natural rate. Supposing corn and manufactured goods always to sell at the same price, profits would be high or low in proportion as wages were low or high. But suppose corn to rise in price because more labor is necessary to produce it. That cause will not raise the price of manufactured goods in the production of which no additional quantity of labor is required. If, as is absolutely certain, wages should rise with the price of corn, then their profits would necessarily fall. But it may be asked whether the farmer at least would not have the same rate of profits, although he should pay an additional sum for wages. Certainly not, for he will not only have to pay, in common with the manufacturer, an increase of wages to each laborer he employs, but he will be obliged either to pay rent or to employ an additional number of laborers to obtain the same produce, and the rise in the price of raw produce will be proportioned only to that rent or that additional number and will not compensate him for the rise in wages. We have shown that in early stages of society, both the landlord's and the laborer's share of the value of the produce of the earth would be but small, and that it would increase in proportion to the progress of wealth and the difficulty of procuring food. These early stages of society are a peculiar bourgeois fantasy. In these early stages, the laborer is either slave or self-supporting peasant, etc. In the first case, he belongs to the landlord, together with the land. In the second case, he is his own landlord. In neither case does any capitalist stand between the landlord and the laborer. The subjugation of agriculture to capitalist production, and hence the transformation of slaves or peasants into wage laborers, and the intervention of the capitalist between landlord and worker, which is only the final result of capitalist production, is regarded by Ricardo as a phenomenon belonging to the early stages of society. The natural tendency of profits, then, is to fall, for in the progress of society and wealth, the additional quantity of food required is obtained by the sacrifice of more and more labor. This tendency, this gravitation, as it were, of profits, is happily checked at repeated intervals by the improvements in machinery connected with the production of necessaries, as well as by discoveries in the science of agriculture, which enable us to relinquish a portion of labor before required, and therefore to lower the price of any prime necessary of the laborer. In the following sentence, Ricardo says, in plain terms, that by rate of profit he understands the rate of surplus value. Although a greater value is produced, a greater proportion of what remains of that value after paying rent is consumed by the producers, and it is this and this alone which regulates profits. In other words, apart from rent, the rate of profit is equal to the excess of the value of the commodity over the value of the labor which is paid during its production, or that part of its value which is consumed by the producers. In this context, Ricardo calls only the workers producers. He assumes that the produced value is produced by them. He thus defines surplus value here as that part of the value created by the workers which the capitalist retains. But if Ricardo identifies rate of surplus value with rate of profit, and at the same time assumes, as he does, that the working day is of given length, then the tendency of the rate of profit to fall can only be explained by the same factors which make the rate of surplus value fall. But with a given working day, the rate of surplus value can only fall if the rate of wages is rising permanently. This is only possible if the value of necessaries is rising permanently. And this only if agriculture is constantly deteriorating. In other words, if Ricardo's theory of rent is accepted. Since Ricardo identifies the rate of surplus value with the rate of profit, and since the rate of surplus value can only be reckoned in relation to variable capital, capital laid out in wages, Ricardo, like Adam Smith, assumes that the value of the whole product, after deduction of rent, is divided between workmen and capitalists into wages and profit. This means that he makes the false presupposition that the whole of the capital advanced consists only of variable capital. Thus, for example, after the passage quoted above, he goes on, when poor lands are taken into cultivation, or when more capital and labor are expended on the old land with a less return of produce, the effect must be permanent. A greater proportion of that part of the produce which remains to be divided after paying rent between the owners of stock and the laborers will be apportioned to the latter. The passage continues. Each man may, and probably will, have a less absolute quantity, but as more laborers are employed in proportion to the whole produce retained by the farmer, the value of a greater portion of the whole produce will be absorbed by wages, and consequently, the value of a smaller portion will be devoted to profits. And shortly before, the remaining quantity of the produce of the land, after the landlord and the laborer are paid, necessarily belongs to the farmer and constitutes the profits of his stock. At the end of this section, Chapter 6 on Profits, Ricardo says that his thesis on the fall of profits remains true even if, which is wrong, it were assumed that the prices of commodities rose with the rise of the money wages of the workers. In the chapter on wages, we have endeavored to show that the money price of commodities would not be raised by a rise of wages. But if it were otherwise, if the prices of commodities were permanently raised by high wages, the proposition would not be less true which asserts that high wages invariably affect the employers of labor by depriving them of a portion of their real profits. Supposing the hatter, the hosier, and the shoemaker each paid £10 more wages in the manufacture of a particular quantity of their commodities, and that the price of hats, stockings, and shoes rose by a sum sufficient to repay the manufacturer the £10, their situation would be no better than if no such rise took place. If the hosier sold his stockings for £110 instead of 100, his profits would be precisely the same money amount as before, but as he would obtain in exchange for this equal sum 1/10 less of hats, shoes, and every other commodity, and as he could with his former amount of savings, that is, with the same capital, employ fewer laborers at the increased wages and purchase fewer raw materials at the increased prices, he would be in no better situation than if his money profits had been really diminished in amount, and everything had remained at its former price. Whereas elsewhere in his argument, Ricardo always only stressed that in order to produce the same quantity of product on worse land, more laborers have to be paid, here at last he stresses what is decisive for the rate of profit, namely that with the same amount of capital, fewer laborers are employed at increased wages. Apart from this, he is not quite right in what he says. It makes no difference to the capitalist if the price of hats, etc., rises by 10%, but the landlord would have to give up more of his rent. His rent may have risen, for example, from £10 to 20, but he gets proportionately fewer hats, etc., for his £20 than for the 10. Ricardo says, quite rightly, in an improving state of society, the net produce of land is always diminishing in proportion to its gross produce. By this, he means that the rent diminishes in an improving state of society. The real reason is that in an improving state of society, the variable capital decreases in proportion to the constant capital. That with the progress of production, the constant capital grows in proportion to the variable, Ricardo himself admits, but only in the form that the fixed capital grows in proportion to the circulating. In rich and powerful countries, where large capitals are invested in machinery, more distress will be experienced from a revulsion in trade than in poorer countries, where there is proportionally a much smaller amount of fixed and a much larger amount of circulating capital, and where consequently more work is done by the labor of men. It is not so difficult to withdraw circulating as a fixed capital from any employment in which it may be engaged. It is often impossible to divert the machinery, which may have been erected for one manufacture, to the purpose of another. But the clothing, the food, and the lodging of the laborer in one employment may be devoted to the support of the laborer in another. Here, therefore, circulating capital comprises only variable capital, capital laid out in wages. Or the same laborer may receive the same food, clothing, and lodging, whilst his employment is changed. This, however, is an evil to which a rich nation must submit, and it would not be more reasonable to complain of it than it would be in a rich merchant to lament that his ship was exposed to the dangers of the sea, whilst his poor neighbor's cottage was safe from all such hazard. Ricardo himself mentions one reason for the rise in rent, which is quite independent of the rise in the price of agricultural produce. Whatever capital becomes fixed on the land must necessarily be the landlord's and not the tenant's at the expiration of the lease. Whatever compensation the landlord may receive for this capital on re-letting his land will appear in the form of rent, but no rent will be paid if, with a given capital, more corn can be obtained from abroad than can be grown on this land at home. On the same subject, Ricardo says, "In a former part of this work, I have noticed the difference between rent, properly so called, and the remuneration paid to the landlord under that name for the advantages which the expenditure of his capital has procured to his tenant. But I did not perhaps sufficiently distinguish the difference which would arise from the different modes in which this capital might be applied. As a part of this capital, when once expended in the improvement of a farm, is inseparably amalgamated with the land and tends to increase its productive powers, the remuneration paid to the landlord for its use is strictly of the nature of rent, and is subject to all the laws of rent. Whether the improvement be made at the expense of the landlord or the tenant, it will not be undertaken in the first instance unless there is strong probability that the return would at least be equal to the profit that can be made by the disposition of any other equal capital. But when once made, the return obtained will ever after be wholly of the nature of rent, and will be subject to all the variations of rent. Some of these expenses, however, only give advantages to the land for a limited period, and do not add permanently to its productive powers. Being bestowed on buildings and other perishable improvements, they require to be constantly renewed, and therefore do not obtain for the landlord any permanent addition to his real rent." Ricardo says, "In all countries and all times, profits depend on the quantity of labor requisite to provide necessaries for the laborers, on that land or with that capital which yields no rent. According to this, the profit of the farmer on that land, the worst land, which according to Ricardo pays no rent, regulates the general rate of profit. The reasoning is this: the product of the worst land is sold at its value and pays no rent. We see here exactly, therefore, how much surplus value remains for the capitalist after deduction of the value of that part of the product which is merely an equivalent for the worker. And this surplus value is the profit. This is based on the assumption that cost price and value are identical, that this product, because it is sold at its cost price, is sold at its value. This is incorrect, historically and theoretically. I have shown that where there is capitalist production and where landed property exists, the land or mine of the worst type cannot pay a rent because the corn is sold below its individual value if it is sold at the market value, which is not regulated by it. For the market value only covers its cost price. But what regulates this cost price? The rate of profit of the non-agricultural capital, into whose determination the price of corn naturally enters as well, however far removed the latter may be from being its sole determinant. Ricardo's assertion would only be correct if values and cost prices were identical. Historically, too, as the capitalist mode of production appears later in agriculture than in industry, agricultural profit is determined by industrial profit, and not the other way around. The only correct point is that on the land which pays a profit but no rent, which sells its product at the cost price, the average rate of profits becomes apparent, is tangibly presented. But this does not mean at all that the average profit is thereby regulated. That would be a very different matter. The rate of profit can fall without any rise in the rate of interest and rate of rent. From the account which has been given of the profits of stock, it will appear that no accumulation of capital will permanently lower profits, unless there be some permanent cause for the rise of wages. If the necessaries of the workman could be constantly increased with the same facility, there could be no permanent alteration in the rate of profit or wages. This should read in the rate of surplus value and the value of labor, to whatever amount capital might be accumulated. Adam Smith, however, uniformly ascribes the fall of profits to the accumulation of capital and to the competition which will result from it, without ever adverting to the increasing difficulty of providing food for the additional number of laborers which the additional capital will employ. The whole thing would only be right if profit were equal to surplus value. Thus, Adam Smith says that the rate of profit falls with the accumulation of capital because of the growing competition between the capitalists. Ricardo says that it does so because of the growing deterioration of agriculture, the increased price of necessaries. We have refuted his view, which would only be correct if rate of surplus value and rate of profit were identical, and therefore the rate of profit could not fall unless the rate of wages rose, provided the working day remained unchanged. Adam Smith's view rests on his compounding value out of wages, profits, and rents, in accordance with his false view, which he himself refuted. According to him, the accumulation of capitals forces the reduction in arbitrary profits, for which there is no inherent measure, through the reduction in the prices of commodities. Profits, according to this conception, being merely a nominal addition to the prices of commodities. Ricardo is, of course, theoretically right when he maintains, in opposition to Adam Smith, that the accumulation of capitals does not alter the determination of the value of commodities. But Ricardo is quite wrong when he seeks to refute Adam Smith by asserting that overproduction in one country is impossible. Ricardo denies the plethora of capital, which later became an established axiom in English political economy. First, he overlooks that in reality, where not only the capitalist confronts the workman, but capitalist, workman, landlord, moneyed interest, people receiving fixed incomes from the state, etc., confront one another. The fall in the prices of commodities, which hits both the industrial capitalist and the workman, benefits the other classes. Secondly, he overlooks that the output level is by no means arbitrarily chosen, but the more capitalist production develops, the more it is forced to produce on a scale which has nothing to do with the immediate demand, but depends on a constant expansion of the world market. He has recourse to Say's trite assumption that the capitalist produces not for the sake of profit, surplus value, but produces use value directly for consumption, for his own consumption. He overlooks the fact that the commodity has to be converted into money. The demand of the workers does not suffice, since profit arises precisely from the fact that the demand of the workers is smaller than the value of their product, and that the profit is all the greater, the smaller relatively is this demand. The demand of the capitalists among themselves is equally insufficient. Overproduction does not call forth a constant fall in profit, but periodic overproduction recurs constantly. It is followed by periods of underproduction, etc. Overproduction arises precisely from the fact that the mass of the people can never consume more than the average quantity of necessaries, that their consumption, therefore, does not grow correspondingly with the productivity of labor. But the whole of this section belongs to the competition of capitals. All that Ricardo says on this isn't worth a rap. This is contained in Chapter 21, Effects of Accumulation on Profits and Interest. There is only one case, and that will be temporary, in which the accumulation of capital with the low price of food may be attended with a fall of profits, and that is when the funds for the maintenance of labor increase much more rapidly than population. Wages will then be high and profits low. In the same chapter, Ricardo directs against Say the following ironic remarks on the relation between profits and interest. Mr. Say allows that the rate of interest depends on the rate of profits, but it does not therefore follow that the rate of profits depends on the rate of interest. One is the cause, the other the effect, and it is impossible for any circumstances to make them change places. However, the same causes which bring down profits can make interest rise, and vice versa. In the chapter on Colonial Trade, Ricardo writes, Mr. Say acknowledges that the cost of production is the foundation of price, and yet, in various parts of his book, he maintains that price is regulated by the proportion which demand bears to supply. Ricardo should have seen from this that the cost of production is something very different from the quantity of labor employed for the production of a commodity. Instead, he continues, the real and ultimate regulator of the relative value of any two commodities is the cost of their production. And does not Adam Smith agree in this opinion, that prices are regulated neither by wages nor profits, when he says that the prices of commodities, or the value of gold and silver as compared with commodities, depends upon the proportion between the quantity of labor which is necessary in order to bring a certain quantity of gold and silver to market, and that which is necessary to bring there a certain quantity of any other sort of goods? That quantity will not be affected, whether profits be high or low, or wages low or high. How then can prices be raised by high profits? In the passage quoted, Adam Smith means by prices nothing other than the monetary expression of the values of commodities, that these and the gold and silver against which they exchange are determined by the relative quantities of labor required for producing those two sorts of commodities on the one side and gold and silver on the other, in no way contradicts the fact that the actual prices of commodities, i.e. their cost prices, can be raised by high profits. Although not all prices simultaneously, as Smith thinks. But as a result of high profits, some commodities will rise higher above their value than if the average profits were low, while another group of commodities will sink to a smaller extent below their value.